You're listening to A Mighty Fortress.
Hello and welcome to A Mighty Fortress. I am your host, Knight Jake. Before we get underway with today's episode, I'd like to just remind everybody of the upcoming Speak Lord conference in October and November, which will be taking place in both Toowoomba, Queensland and Tanunda, South Australia. For details of that, you can go onto the CLAM website. Go to www.clam.info, that is the website for Confessional Lutherans of Australia Media Ministry. Go along and find the conference tab. Go down to Speak Lord 2016, click there, and there'll be a button there you can click that will send you to the website that should provide you with all the details. If you wish to catch up on last year's conference, which was the Speak Lord 2015 conference in Tanunda, you can find the audio for that conference on CLAM under the conferences tab. Now, last week we spoke a bit about why I was a monarchist, and we dealt a little bit with the topic of vocation. I think it's a very important topic. It deals with our very calling in life, and therefore it is very important to understand. And so I would like to get a more learned scholar, theologian on who could actually explain the doctrine of vocation better. But on today's episode, I'm going to attempt to give a more rookie summarization of the doctrine of vocation. So I'm not an expert and I'm not that learned, so I'm not that well versed and researched in this topic, so do forgive me if I make any mistakes, do permit my ignorance. I'm going to try my best, but let's go ahead and I'll give you my brief summarization of the doctrine of vocation. Before I do that, I'd like to recommend Gene Edward Veith Jr.'s book, God at Work, Your Christian Vocation in All of Life. It's a very excellent book on the doctrine of vocation. It's informative, well written. The book holds very firm to the Lutheran understanding of vocation, and it explains the doctrine in a very clear and easy to understand way which any layperson would be able to understand. A lot of problems in our modern church have developed out of a misunderstanding or just a complete ignorance of the doctrine of vocation. It said the doctrine of vocation is our calling in this world. Vocation comes from the Latin term which means calling, and thus it's our calling in life. If you're a husband, that is your calling. If you're a brother, that is your calling. If you're an employer, that is your calling. If you're a politician, that is your calling. If you're a citizen, that is your calling. Now, each person has multiple callings. You're not just called to one. Such as a person can be a husband, a father, a brother, an employer, an employee, a citizen, and all those things at once, because they are multiple callings. And in other words, we have callings in our work, in our family, and as citizens in a larger society. And yes, we also have callings as our place in a church, which is actually one of the most important ones to remember. As pastors, we're called to be shepherds. As parishioners, we're called to be sheep in that sense. You're called to come to church and submit to the authority of the pastor, trust him, listen to him, be taught by him, be cared for by him. That's generally the job of a layperson. Now, I'm not saying that's it. You have callings to serve your neighbour. You have callings to preach the word as well, in a different context as a pastor. You're not called to the office of the ministry, but you are still called to go out and to preach and to serve and do all that kind of church work. Which is another thing that's important. One problem with the doctrine of vocation is that a lot of churches have this emphasis on, more superior roles. A lot of Hillsong-style churches place such a heavy emphasis on being a worship leader or being part of the band or being involved in some aspect of worship or church, and it really diminishes the importance of the ordinary layperson. In other words, what they've done is they've painted this big picture of the extraordinary, which has diminished the ordinary. People have placed such a large emphasis on the pastor that they forget that the everyday parishioner also has a calling, that the everyday layperson can also preach God's word and also minister to their fellow Christians. I think this happens a lot in churches. It's not just your mega churches, it's also just in your normal small Lutheran congregations where we place too much emphasis on the pastors and the elders to the point that we ignore the lay people. Now, on the flip side, we shouldn't not place an emphasis on pastors and elders and people that have been called into positions of authority, because that is their calling, and we shouldn't ignore their authority, we shouldn't ignore their calling, we should respect their authority, we should acknowledge their calling and allow them to do their work. But we don't need to emphasize their callings to the extent of ignoring the callings of the layperson. An average parishioner has the calling to come to church, to hear the word, and to take that word out into the world around them. As a parishioner, you're called to come to the church, receive God's word, receive healing, forgiveness, receive communion, take your teaching that you've received, and take the forgiveness that you've received and go out and spread that message to the world. Every Christian is called to go and love their neighbour and to serve their neighbour and to spread the gospel message to the world. Any ordinary layperson can do this, and that is your calling as a layperson. And we need to be aware that lay people are important, and we need to make sure that we place an important emphasis on the layperson. One issue that I've observed in modern churches is also the need to spiritualize a person's vocation. What I mean by this is that in many modern churches, they have separated church and state in the realm of vocation. Now, I need to clarify that. Church and state need to be separated. That's an important Lutheran doctrine on the understanding of the two kingdoms. Really feel like I should have a day, also an episode where I just go through an explanation of the two kingdoms. Many modern churches separate a Christian's vocation into church and state. So they kind of have, these are my stately callings, these are my churchly callings. So, as a citizen of this country, or as a father, or as a husband, or as a worker, these are my state vocations, these are my worldly callings. They're worldly, they don't involve the church. However, playing in the band, or being a worship leader, or being a pastor, these are my Christian vocations. These are my heavenly callings. These are my churchly callings. They're much more important. They're the ones that get the focus. And that, again, it's this whole issue of ignoring the layperson, ignoring the ordinary. People go and they go, I need to get more involved in the church, because when I'm involved in the church, then I'm doing God's work. But if I'm just at home, I'm not doing God's work. No. When you're at home, you're doing God's work. You get this all the time, like husbands or wives that feel like they need to get involved in the church instead of staying home and just being a good husband and wife and a good mother and father. Men and women who want to get involved in the church and say that they have to get out of the home and do something in order to contribute to God's work, not realizing that by just staying home and being a good, loving, serving Christian husband, father, wife and mother, that they're actually doing God's work. When you stay home and look after your family, you are serving God by serving your neighbour. You are loving your neighbour as yourself, and you're serving God with all your heart, soul and mind. You're fulfilling the two greatest commandments in all the law. By staying home and serving your neighbour, you serve God. As Christ says, when you fed the hungry, gave water to the thirsty, clothed the poor, visited those locked in prison, you did whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. Whatever you did not do to the least of these, you did not do to me. So this is why understanding the doctrine of vocation is important, because you need to remember that when we do our service to the least of these, we are serving Christ. So our daily vocation is also a heavenly vocation. There's no separation between heavenly things and earthly things when it comes to vocation. Whether you're a pastor or whether you're a father, whether you're a husband, whether you're a church elder, whatever your calling is, you're serving God in that vocation. And you're serving your neighbour. And the important aspect of the doctrine of vocation is understanding your rights and responsibilities in your calling, and understanding what are my duties, what are my responsibilities in this calling, how in this calling do I best serve God and my neighbour. So as a husband, love your wife, care for your wife, treat her like Christ treated the church, keep her strong in the faith, have that mutual Christian education, make sure that your wife is educated, make sure she comes to church. Wives, vice versa, make sure that your husbands come to church. Love him, submit to him, be a good wife. Parents, raise your children right, teach them, train them, bring them up in the faith. These are the ways that you serve your neighbour and that you serve God. Employers and employees, if you are work in a retail shop, how do you best serve God and your neighbour? Well, be a fair salesperson. Don't try to cheat people, sell things for the correct price. Treat them respectfully. If possible, bring them God's word, but if not, show them what it means to be a Christian. If you can't get up and just proclaim a gospel message, then just live the good Christian life. Show people what it means to be a Christian through your daily walk. Hopefully they will come to know that you're a Christian. Hopefully they may already know that you are a Christian, and by seeing you, they see Christ. Be Christ to them. That's the importance of vocation in those areas. Going back to this issue of, like I said, spiritualizing or sometimes Christianizing vocation. A lot of modern people also have this problem of they have to over-spiritualize or over-Christianize their vocation. For example, a person can't just be an actor. They have to be a Christian actor. They have to act in Christian movies. They can't act in secular movies because that's not serving God. Or if they're going to be a singer, they have to write only Christian songs. They can't write secular songs. Or if they want to be a shopkeeper, they have to work in a Christian bookstore or something like that. People that, again, they're ignoring the ordinary and they're refusing the normal secular jobs. Every job they have has to be Christianized in some way. And there's nothing wrong with that in the sense. There's nothing wrong with singing Christian songs or being an actor in Christian movies or working in a Christian bookstore. But just remember that you don't need to separate church and state when it comes to vocation. You can serve God in a secular vocation. You can serve God by being in non-Christian movies. You can still serve God by working in non-Christian shops. You don't need to work in exclusively Christian stores in order to serve God. You can serve God wherever you are, which is the point of the doctrine of vocation. How do I serve God and serve my neighbour in my calling in life? Wherever you are. You don't have to specifically seek out certain Christian vocations. You can just serve God in your normal, everyday, secular vocation. People feel like the only way they can serve God is by Christianizing their vocation or by getting in some kind of Christian vocation. They have to be involved in the church, or if they're not in the church, they have to overemphasize the Christian aspect of their vocation, because otherwise, if they don't do that, they're not serving God. And the biggest problem is that this actually comes out of a doctrine of salvation by works. These people feel like they have to be involved in the church, or they have to do some kind of Christian vocation, because if they're not doing it, they're not serving God, they're not serving their neighbour properly, and they're not being a Christian. What they're doing is that they're putting emphasis on themselves and what they're doing, and they're not actually just living out the Christian faith. They're forcing themselves to have to do the Christian thing. The idea of the doctrine of vocation is how to serve God and serve your neighbour best, where God has placed you in your life. God calls you into this. Like I said, the word vocation comes from the Latin word meaning calling. God has called you here. You haven't chosen that vocation. And this is another aspect that I'll get to with understanding vocation, that vocation is not something you choose, it's something you're called into. Gene Veith says in his book that our vocation is not something we choose for ourselves, it is something to which we are called. This is a true understanding of the doctrine of vocation. It's not something that we get to choose, it's something that we're called into. However, many modern people will use this concept of the call as an offense to do whatever they desire. Whenever something arises, people instantly use the "I'm called to do this." I've seen it all the time where people just go, "Oh, well, I feel that God is calling me to do this, therefore I can do this." A lot of modern youth in the church actually do this a lot, I've noticed, where they just say, "I feel God calling me to this." In a sense, that is true. God does call us into these positions, but this is coming from a misunderstanding and misuse of call. You're using the call to justify your own desires. The call is meant to be actually something that God calls you into, and you as a Christian submit to God's calling and accept where He places you in life. Instead, people are misusing the call to fuel their own choices, their own desires and their own will. And they pretty much just do whatever they want, and then they go ahead and say, "Well, you can't blame me because God called me here." And I go, well, that's not right. You're misusing the doctrine of vocation. You're misusing what it means to be called into your vocation. As V says, our calling comes from outside of ourselves, and it must be emphasized that our inner feelings do not entitle us to any specific calling. We may possess an aspect of freedom when it comes to choosing our vocation, but we don't really choose our vocation in general. We are called into it. Our vocation is not a mere matter of our choice. Instead, it is the place in which we are currently placed in life. Many of our vocations that we possess actually give us no choice. We have absolutely no choice. We are just called into that vocation and we don't get to decide otherwise. These are vocations such as child, sibling and citizen. We're born with these vocations. You're born as a child to your parents. You're born as a sibling to your siblings. You're born as a citizen of the country that you're born into. You don't really get a choice. You are called into this vocation whether you like it or not. In other vocations, we do possess some aspect of freedom, but in the end, we don't really end up choosing the vocation that we end up in. A person cannot simply choose the vocation of marriage. A couple may decide to get married. They may both choose, but in the end, it's not solely your choice. You may choose your spouse, but she must choose you back. Also, a person cannot simply choose which career they want. There's a lot of issues here. You can't just simply choose which vocation you want to have. Firstly, a job needs to exist. Like, I can't choose a vocation if it doesn't exist. That's kind of impossible. I can't choose to be an intergalactic mailman because there's no such job. I can't choose that. So I can't be called into the vocation of intergalactic mailman because it doesn't exist. Next, there also needs to be a demand. For example, I can't get hired into a job if they're not actually hiring people. And lastly, I finally actually have to get hired. I can say all I want that I want to be a pastor, but I actually still have to graduate. I still actually have to be called to a church. These are a lot of things that I don't get a choice in. These are the choices of other people. And so I am called into those positions. I get called to a congregation. I don't just choose to rock up one day and say, "Okay, I'm now your pastor." No, I get called to serve there. And this is how it works for pretty much any vocation. Unless you choose to become self-employed, you cannot just simply choose to work where you want to. You actually have to be hired. You have to be called into that job. Whether it's working at Macca's or it's working in a CEO, you can't just choose to have that job. You have to be hired. And in order to be hired, there needs to be a demand, there needs to be a want for you, there needs to be somebody actually wanting to hire you. And in order to do that, there also needs to be the job in the first place. This is how it works with the doctrine of vocation. We have a freedom in some sense to direct we do have some freedom to direct our lives, but in the end, our lives are dependent not on ourselves, but on those around us. And when it gets right down to it, our vocations depend on God. Where does He want us? We need to accept God's authority. We need to submit to God and let Him actually call us where He's calling us. Also, we need to make sure that we are called into our vocations. And we can't just force ourselves into vocations because we feel that we want that vocation. In V's book, he uses the example of a college student who wishes to be an accountant. He says there's a high demand for accountants, so therefore the student wants to be an accountant. However, this student lacks the mathematic skills to actually be an accountant. He can work hard, he can study hard, but no matter how hard he tries, he just does not possess those mathematic skills required to be an accountant. As V says, this probably is not his calling. And therefore, if it's not your calling, it's better that you don't try and force yourself into that calling. There are two major issues that come from a misunderstanding of how to distinguish between desire and call. One issue that arises is that a person can either force their way into or stay in a vocation that they should probably leave or shouldn't have been in the first place, or there's the flip side of a person who leaves a vocation that they shouldn't leave, that they should actually stay in. Some people are stubborn and they will refuse to leave a vocation that they are just not called to. Like an accountant that has no mathematics skills, or a mechanic that just clearly doesn't know anything about cars. By staying in these vocations, they are causing more harm than good. Now, on the other hand, when people associate desire with call, we find many people choosing to leave vocations simply because they no longer feel called to that. For example, pastors that just desert their flocks because of hardships, or a soldier that deserts his post because fighting becomes too heavy. These people, they get pressured, they get stressed, and they no longer feel the calling to their position. And so since they no longer feel that calling, they just leave that calling. And in doing that, they're causing a lot of harm and damage. Now, there are also some vocations that are actually people have been called into, and they just don't feel called to that vocation, but they're actually sinful to leave. For example, a person that gets divorced because they no longer feel called to be married to that person. Well, now you're actually sinning in that. You're actually getting divorced for an illegitimate reason. The Bible gives the only two reasons for divorce are desertion and adultery. You can't just go, well, you know, I'm having some hard troubles with my wife at the moment, therefore I'm just going to divorce this woman because I no longer feel called. You're using the word call as an excuse to fuel your own desires. You're just being selfish. You're not loving your wife, you're not caring for your wife, you're just being selfish because you feel stressed or pressured that you're no longer happy with your marriage. So instead of actually fulfilling your vocation and actually looking after your wife and working hard to have a good marriage, you're just giving up and walking away. And you're actually being sinful in that because you're getting divorced, and divorce is a sin. Another example is the woman who falls pregnant for whatever reason and says, well, I just don't feel called to be a mother, therefore I'm going to go and get an abortion. No, that's wrong. You're killing a baby. Abortion is a big topic, but I personally believe that it's not just a fetus, it's not just some blobs of tissue and cells. I actually believe that from the point of conception, there is a life in there. That is a living human being. And getting an abortion is equal to murder. And you can't just go and commit murder because you feel like it. You can't just go and abort a baby because you don't feel called to be a mother. No, whatever reason there is for you getting pregnant, I don't care. You are called to be that child's mother. You're called to look after that child. You're called to serve that child, whether that means actually giving birth to that child and becoming its mother, or giving birth to that child and giving it up for adoption. The point is, as long as that child is in your womb, you are called to look after that child. That is your vocation. You have to serve God and your neighbour best by serving that child in your womb. People may disagree with me. Some people may think that I'm being sexist or oppressive by telling women that they can't abort their babies. Well, guess what? You think I'm oppressing women because I'm telling them they can't get an abortion? Well, guess what? I believe that abortion is equal to murder, so that I think people that support abortion are actually supporting murder. You may disagree with me, and you're free to disagree with me. And you can't just give up your vocation because of trials or tribulations or even failure. As Christians, we are called to bear crosses. We need to remember that we do not choose our vocation, but that we are called to our vocation. That we have a responsibility to serve our neighbour in our vocation, whether we feel like it or not. If a person is married, then he or she is called to marriage. He cannot just simply get divorced because he no longer feels called to that vocation. Following on this line of misunderstanding desire and call, there is also the idea that some vocations are just not appropriate to be called into. A job may exist and there may actually be a demand, but there are certain vocations that are sinful and not God-pleasing, such as thief, embezzler, contract killer, prostitutes, drug dealers. These are just vocations that are sinful. They're illegitimate vocations that don't exist. As Vief says in his book, the early church made the gladiators give up their profession because this was not a legitimate vocation. Just by claiming that you feel called to a vocation does not automatically make a vocation legitimate. Just because you feel to be a drug dealer doesn't make that a legitimate vocation. There are other vocations that are also just sinful and not legitimate vocations, even though they're not criminal, such as women pastors or people that are, homosexual husbands and wives. These are not legitimate vocations, and you can't just simply call them legitimate just because you feel called. You can't just claim that because you feel called to be a woman pastor, that therefore women's ordination should just be right. No, you can't just call yourself into a vocation because you feel you're called to that vocation. You're misunderstanding what the doctrine of vocation is, and you're misusing the doctrine of vocation to fuel your own desires. You're confusing desire with call. There's the big problem in the current church. It's the problem of our postmodern age where people just go, well, I feel this, so therefore it is right. You know, that's right for you, but this is right for me. I feel that this is right, therefore it must be right. So therefore, I want to say, what is the proper way to understand the doctrine of vocation? I feel a proper understanding of vocation is threefold. Firstly, that vocation is the means through which God has chosen to serve human beings. Vocation is how God serves us, how the gospel is spread, and how we best serve God and our neighbour. Secondly, God works through vocations. God works through the ordinary. All vocations are equal in status to serving God, unless they are sinful vocations, such as embezzler, thief, contract killer, etc., etc. All legitimate vocations are equal in their status to serving God. There's no concept of extra special vocations. By serving God and by serving your neighbour, by finding out what are your rights and responsibilities to your vocation, and by fulfilling your duties within that vocation, that is the best way of serving God. You serve God best by actually fulfilling your duties in that vocation, not by trying to find some kind of better vocation. Serve God where you are called in life. Don't try and seek out some better calling. And thirdly, your vocation is that position in life to which you are currently called. Stick with it. Sure, vocations change, such as when your parents die, you are no longer called to the vocation of child. This is an important thing to understand. The vocation of child doesn't end when you grow up. You are still a child to your parents. You are still called to love them and care for them. You only stop being a child when your parents actually pass away. And when you grow up, you go from being only a child to moving into vocations like husband, like father. And when your career changes, your vocation also changes. You can go from being a truck driver to being a mechanic. You can go from being a student to actually graduating and actually getting employed in whatever you've been studying. So a vocation can change over time, but the important aspect of vocation is your vocation is not what you're going to be. Your vocation is not where you are in the future. Your vocation is where you are called at the moment. I kind of feel that's all I can really say on the doctrine of vocation, and I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk about the doctrine of vocation. I hope you've benefited from it, and I hope you can join me again next time for another episode of A Mighty Fortress. I've been your host, Knight Jake. Goodbye and God bless. Thank you for listening to A Mighty Fortress. A Mighty Fortress